People said the canyon had already given up its dead, but the dog never believed them. The wind moves first, low and steady, brushing through the red stone walls of Red Hollow Canyon like a whisper that has nowhere else to go, carrying dust, memory, and something older than both, something that settles into the bones if you stand still long enough. And on that late October afternoon, under a sky stretched pale and endless above the Arizona desert, a German shepherd named Rex refuses to move. He stands at the edge of a narrow drop, paws planted in loose gravel, chest rising slow but firm, amber eyes locked on a single point below, as if the earth itself had spoken to him, and he had chosen to listen, truly listen, in a way no human ever quite manages to. And behind him, about 20 feet back on the worn trail, Caleb Turner stops walking, not because he's tired, not because the heat, still lingering in the high 70s even this late in the season, has caught up to him, but because something in the stillness ahead doesn't feel right, because Rex never freezes like that without reason, never holds a line like a soldier guarding a perimeter, and Caleb would know, having spent 8 years learning what it means to read silence, the kind of silence that hums louder than noise. He shifts his weight, boots crunching lightly over the rust-colored dirt, and calls out, "Rex!" Not loud, not sharp, just enough to break the moment if it's nothing, just enough to test if this is one of those times where instinct is wrong, where a dog chases a scent that leads nowhere. But Rex doesn't turn, doesn't flick an ear, doesn't acknowledge the command at all, and that's when Caleb feels it, that quiet tightening in his chest, the same one he used to feel before something went sideways overseas, the kind of warning that doesn't shout, doesn't panic, just settles in and waits to see if you're paying attention. He takes a few careful steps closer, the canyon widening around him, walls rising like broken cathedrals of stone, shadows stretching long and thin across the ground, and as he approaches, he notices the small things first, because it's always the small things that matter, the way Rex's tail is low but not tucked, the way his ears are forward, alert but not afraid, the way his body leans ever so slightly toward the drop, not as if he's about to jump, but as if he's guarding something, holding a line that no one else can see. Caleb stops just behind him now, close enough to hear the dog's breath, steady and controlled, and for a moment, either of them moves, the wind slipping between them, carrying the faint scent of dried brush and sun-warmed stone, and Caleb follows Rex's gaze down into the narrow cut below, where jagged rocks and scattered scrub disappear into shadow, where nothing obvious calls for attention, nothing moves, nothing signals danger or life or anything in between, and yet Rex remains, unmoving, unyielding, as if leaving would mean breaking a promise he never made out loud. Caleb exhales slowly, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck, feeling the weight of something he can't yet name pressing gently but persistently against his thoughts, and he tries. Again, softer this time. "Come on, buddy, let's go!" But the words hang in the air and fall flat, because Rex doesn't respond, doesn't even shift his stance, and that's when Caleb understands this isn't about disobedience, this isn't about a stubborn dog or a random scent caught in the wind, this is something else, something deliberate, something chosen, and he crouches slightly, lowering himself to Rex's level, eyes narrowing as he studies the ground near the edge. The faint disturbances in the dust, the way the gravel seems slightly displaced, as if something, or someone, had been there once, long enough to leave a trace that time never quite erased. The canyon remains quiet, almost too quiet, like it's holding its breath, waiting, and Caleb doesn't know it yet, but this moment, this refusal, this stillness, this dog who simply will not walk away, is the beginning of a truth buried for 4 years. A truth the world had already decided to forget, except for one creature who never did. Caleb does not move right away, not because he doubts the dog, but because he understands that moments like this demand patience, the kind that is learned the hard way, the kind that keeps you alive when rushing forward only makes things worse, and for a long second he simply watches Rex, studies the way the animal holds himself against the edge of that canyon as if there is a line drawn there that cannot be crossed, and then, slowly, Caleb steps closer, boots sliding a few inches on loose gravel before finding steadier ground, and he crouches beside the dog, lowering himself into the same stillness, letting the desert speak in its own quiet language. The wind shifts again, carrying a faint scent upward, something dry, something old, not strong enough to register clearly but enough to make Rex's nose twitch ever so slightly. And Caleb notices that, because he always notices the small things, the details others miss, the same details that once told him when to stay down, when to move, when to trust the silence, and when to break it. He reaches out, resting his hand lightly against Rex's shoulder, feeling the tension there, not fear, not panic, but resolve, a steady kind of certainty. That does not ask for permission, and Caleb exhales through his nose, slow and controlled, as if grounding himself in the moment, as if reminding his own body that he is here, not somewhere else, not back in a place where the air smelled different and the stakes were measured in seconds. "All right," he murmurs under his breath, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement, a quiet agreement between man and dog, and he shifts his weight forward, leaning just enough to peer more carefully into the drop below, his eyes adjusting to the contrast between sunlit stone and shadowed recesses, tracing the jagged lines of rock, the scattered brush clinging stubbornly to narrow ledges, the small pockets where wind and time have carved out hidden spaces that could hold anything or nothing at all. For a moment, he sees nothing, just the natural chaos of the canyon, the kind of place where things disappear not because they are hidden, but because they are swallowed whole by distance and shadow, and yet Rex does not move, does not relax, and that is what unsettles Caleb the most, because this is not a reaction that fades, this is a position held, like a sentry who has already decided that leaving is not an option. Caleb straightens slightly, scanning the surrounding area now, not just the drop, but the trail behind them, the slope to the left, the faint impressions in the dust that might have been footprints once, long ago, worn down by wind and time until they are barely more than suggestions, and his mind begins to work the way it used to, piecing together fragments, asking quiet questions without expecting immediate answers. And somewhere in the back of that process something stirs, a memory not fully formed, a name he has not thought about in years, something tied to this canyon, to this place that people stopped talking about because talking did not bring anything back. He glances down at Rex again, noticing how the dog shifts his paw slightly, scraping at the ground near the edge, not digging with urgency, but marking, indicating, repeating the same small motion as if to say here, here, here. And Caleb feels that tightening in his chest return, stronger now, more defined. Not fear, but recognition, the kind that arrives before understanding, and he presses his lips together, thinking, measuring, and then he does something simple, something that feels almost insignificant but carries weight all the same. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out his phone, the screen lighting faintly in the afternoon sun, and he hesitates for just a second, thumb hovering, because once he makes that call, once he brings others into this, the quiet will break, the moment will shift. And whatever Rex has been holding on to alone will no longer belong just to them. And yet he knows he cannot ignore this, cannot walk away from a signal this clear, not when the dog has already decided he will not leave. And Caleb Turner has learned, through years he does not talk about, that sometimes the only way forward is to trust the one who refuses to turn back. The call connects on the third ring, a voice on the other end steady but already tired in the way small-town voices often are, carrying the weight of too many routine concerns and not enough reasons to expect anything different, and Caleb keeps his eyes on the canyon as he speaks, his tone measured, giving only what matters. Coordinates, a brief explanation, no dramatics, no assumptions, just facts shaped by instinct rather than proof, and there is a pause on the line, the kind that stretches just long enough to suggest doubt, before the sheriff answers with a calm acknowledgement that sounds more like courtesy than urgency, telling him someone will come take a look, nothing more, nothing less. Caleb ends the call and slips the phone back into his pocket. The quiet returning almost immediately, heavier now, as if the canyon itself has been listening, waiting to see what he would do, and beside him Rex shifts slightly, not away, never away, but forward, inching closer to the edge with that same deliberate focus, his nose dipping toward the wind, drawing in something that Caleb still cannot fully detect, something buried too deep for human senses but not for a dog that has decided this place matters. Minutes pass, maybe 10, maybe 20. Time moving differently out here where there are no clocks, only Shadows stretching longer across the stone, and Caleb stays. Because leaving feels wrong. Because every instinct he has learned tells him that once you walk away from a moment like this, you do not always get a second chance to return to it the same way. When the distant sound of an engine finally cuts through the stillness, it feels almost out of place, mechanical and sharp against the natural hush of the canyon. And Caleb glances back over his shoulder as a county truck makes its slow approach along the dirt road above, tires kicking up a thin trail of dust that lingers in the sunlight. And a few minutes later Sheriff Tom Grady steps out, hat pulled low, posture relaxed but attentive, the kind of man who has seen enough to stay grounded but not enough to expect miracles. He walks over at an unhurried pace, boots steady on the uneven ground, eyes moving from Caleb to Rex to the canyon below, taking in the scene without speaking at first, and when he finally does, his voice carries a gentle skepticism, not dismissive, but cautious, asking what exactly Caleb thinks he is looking at, and Caleb does not answer right away, because he knows how it sounds, knows that words like this rarely carry weight without evidence, so instead he gestures toward Rex, letting the dog speak in the only way he can, through stillness, through refusal, through a presence that does not fade. Grady watches for a moment, longer than Caleb expected, his gaze narrowing slightly as he studies the dog's posture, the way Rex does not break focus, does not wander, does not lose interest the way most animals would after a few minutes. And something shifts, just a fraction, in the sheriff's expression, not belief yet but attention, the kind that leans closer rather than turning away. "He been like this the whole time?" Grady asks quietly, and Caleb nods once, simple, certain, and the sheriff exhales slowly, looking back down into the canyon, scanning the terrain with a more careful eye now, tracing lines and shadows the way Caleb had earlier, searching for anything that might justify what he is seeing, anything that might explain why a trained, disciplined animal would choose this exact spot and hold it as if it mattered more than anything else in the world, and for a moment it seems like he will shrug it off. Mark it as nothing, another dead end in a place that has seen too many of them. But then Rex moves again, just a small motion, a step forward and a low, controlled sound in his throat, not a bark, not a growl, something in between, something that feels less like a warning and more like a call, and both men hear it, both men feel it, and the canyon, for the first time since they arrived, does not feel empty anymore. Grady does not speak right away, and that silence matters, because it is no longer the silence of dismissal, it is the silence of a man recalibrating, of someone who has just felt something shift beneath the surface of what he thought he understood, and he steps closer to the edge, boots grinding softly against the gravel, lowering himself just enough to get a better angle without losing footing. His eyes narrowing as he studies the same stretch of canyon that had seemed empty only minutes ago. And this time he does not scan it like a routine check, this time he studies it the way a man studies a problem that refuses to be simple. Rex moves again, not forward, not down, but sideways, tracing a narrow line along the edge as if following something invisible, his nose dipping and lifting, catching fragments of scent that rise and fall with the shifting wind, and then he stops again, almost exactly 3 feet from where he had first planted himself, and he lowers his head, pressing his snout close to the ground, inhaling slowly, deliberately, and then he scrapes once at the dust. A single controlled motion that sends a thin line of loose dirt sliding over the edge and disappearing into the shadow below. Caleb watches every movement, every repetition, and he recognizes the pattern now, not random, not uncertain, but intentional, like coordinates being marked without words, and he glances at Grady, who has seen it too, the subtle precision of it, the way the dog is not reacting but indicating. "He is showing us something," Caleb says quietly, not as a theory, but as a statement, and Grady exhales through his nose, eyes still fixed on the ground where Rex had scratched, then down into the canyon again, his jaw tightening slightly as he considers the implications, and for a moment the weight of old conversations returns, memories of reports filed years ago, of search teams that combed through miles of terrain, of families who waited and then slowly learned how to stop waiting out loud. The sheriff straightens, pulling a pair of sunglasses from his shirt pocket and sliding them on. Not to block the sun, but to sharpen his view. to cut the glare off the rock and see deeper into the shadows, and he takes a few careful steps along the edge, mirroring Rex's path, stopping where the dog stopped, looking where the dog looked, and this time he notices something he had missed before, a slight irregularity in the slope below, not dramatic, not obvious, just a subtle break in the natural pattern of the rock, a place where debris seems to have gathered differently, as if time had settled there unevenly. "You see that?" he asks. His voice lower now, more focused, and Caleb follows his gaze, leaning slightly, adjusting his angle until the shape becomes clearer, a shallow recess tucked beneath an overhang, partially hidden by brush and shadow, the kind of place that would not catch the eye unless you were already looking for it, unless something or someone had told you exactly where to look. Rex lets out that same low sound again, softer this time, almost like confirmation, and he sits, not out of rest, but out of decision, as if his part in guiding them has reached a point where it must pass to them, and Caleb feels it then, fully formed now. The realization that this is no coincidence, that whatever lies below has been waiting, not discovered, not understood, just waiting, and that Rex, for reasons Caleb cannot yet explain, has carried that knowledge without words until this exact moment. Grady turns slightly, scanning the ridge behind them, already thinking ahead, already shifting from doubt to action, and he reaches for his radio, pressing the button with a steadier hand than before, his voice calm but different now, carrying an edge of urgency that had not been there earlier, calling for additional units. For rope, for a closer look at a specific location he now describes with precision, and as the response crackles back through the speaker, confirming they are on their way, the canyon seems to change again, not in sound, not in movement, but in presence, as if something long buried has finally been acknowledged, and in that quiet acknowledgement, the space between what was lost and what might be found grows just a little smaller. The sound of approaching vehicles grows slowly at first, distant and softened by the canyon walls, then clearer as two more county trucks make their way along the ridge road, tires crunching over gravel and dry earth, carrying with them the kind of presence that shifts a moment from quiet suspicion into something real, something that can no longer be ignored, and Caleb steps back a few feet to give them space while Rex remains where he is, seated at the edge, unmoving, as if the arrival of others does not change his purpose, as if whatever he has been guarding does not belong to noise or urgency but to something deeper, something patient. Sheriff Grady meets the incoming deputies halfway, exchanging a few low words, gesturing toward the edge, his hand tracing the same invisible line Rex had drawn minutes earlier, and within moments the routine begins, not rushed, not chaotic, but deliberate, practiced, rope bags unloaded, harnesses checked, radios clipped into place, each movement carrying the quiet professionalism of people who have done this before but are not entirely sure what they will find this time. Caleb watches from just behind them, arms loosely at his sides, his attention split between the activity unfolding and the dog who started it all. And he notices that Rex does not track the deputies, does not react to the clinking gear or the shifting voices. His focus remains locked on that same unseen point below, unwavering, as if even now he is still guiding, still holding that line until someone else can carry it forward. One of the deputies, a younger man with sun-reddened skin and a careful demeanor, secures his harness and approaches the edge under Grady's watch, testing the anchor point twice before easing himself over boots, finding narrow ledges, gloved hands gripping rope as he descends slowly into the canyon's shadow, and the moment he drops out of direct sunlight, the temperature seems to change, the warmth of the afternoon giving way to a cooler, heavier air that clings to the stone, and his voice crackles faintly over the radio as he calls out distances, angles, small observations that sound routine but carry a growing undercurrent of focus. Above, the rest of the team listens in silence, each word painting a clearer picture of the terrain below, the slope, the brush, the shallow recess that had caught their attention, and Caleb feels something shift again, not in the canyon, but in himself, a quiet tightening that comes from knowing they are close to something that matters, something that has waited longer than it should have. Rex stands now, slowly, stepping closer to the edge again, aligning himself almost directly above where the deputy is descending, his body angled forward, ears fixed, and Caleb watches him carefully, recognizing that this is not restlessness, this is confirmation, the dog adjusting as the search moves closer to its mark, and for a brief second Caleb places a hand on Rex's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, grounding himself in that certainty, that silent assurance that they are not chasing nothing. Below, the deputy's voice changes, not louder, not panicked, but sharper, more focused, as he describes the recess in clearer terms now, a narrow pocket beneath an overhang, partially concealed by brush and compacted debris, a place that could easily be missed from above. A place that does not reveal itself unless someone is already looking directly at it, and he pauses there, just for a moment, the kind of pause that carries weight even without explanation, and up on the ridge, every movement stills, every breath seems to hold as if the canyon itself is listening for what comes next. Caleb does not move, does not speak, his eyes fixed on the line where Rex stands, because he understands something now that he could not have explained an hour ago, that this was never about chance. Never about coincidence, this was about persistence, about a memory carried not in words but in instinct, in scent, in something that refuses to fade even when time tries to erase it, and as the deputy finally speaks again, his voice quieter, more deliberate, the kind that acknowledges the gravity of what he is seeing without yet naming it, Caleb closes his eyes for just a fraction of a second, not in fear, not in dread, but in recognition. Because whatever waits in that hidden space below, it is no longer lost, and the dog who refused to leave has already done the hardest part. He stayed. The radio goes quiet for a heartbeat after the deputy's last words, and in that brief absence of sound, something settles over the ridge, not fear, not confusion, but a kind of understanding that arrives without being spoken, and Sheriff Grady shifts his stance slightly, eyes fixed on the rope line as if he can see through stone and shadow, as if distance no longer matters now that the truth has begun to surface. "Go ahead," he says finally, his voice low but steady, giving the man below permission to continue, to move closer, to confirm what instinct and silence have already suggested, and the reply comes back measured, careful, describing the space beneath the overhang in clearer detail now, a shallow cavity no more than 6 feet deep, partially shielded from wind and weather, the kind of place that could offer brief shelter but also conceal what time leaves behind, and as the deputy adjusts his footing, shifting to a more stable position, his next words come slower, chosen with care, not because he is uncertain, but because he understands that once spoken, they cannot be taken back. Above, Caleb stands with one hand resting lightly against Rex's shoulder, feeling the subtle rise and fall of the dog's breathing, steady and calm, as if this moment, this exact moment, has been waiting for them both, and he does not look at the others, does not search their faces for confirmation, because he already knows, not in detail, not in full clarity, but in the quiet way a man knows when something long unresolved is finally being brought into the light. Rex leans forward slightly, ears fixed, body aligned with the line of descent, and for the first time since they arrived, he lets out a soft exhale that is almost a release, almost a shift from holding to allowing, as if the burden he carried has reached its end and can now be handed over to those who speak in words instead of instinct. The deputy below continues, describing small, human details rather than abstract shapes, fragments that do not belong to the canyon itself, items that speak of presence, of time spent, of a story that unfolded quietly out of sight, and each word builds upon the last, forming a picture that is no longer theoretical, no longer imagined, but real, grounded in place and evidence. And as he speaks, the tone in his voice changes again, not louder, not urgent, but weighted, respectful, as if he has stepped into something that demands care rather than speed. Sheriff Grady lowers his head slightly, one hand resting against his hip, absorbing the information without interruption. His expression tightening not in shock but in recognition, the kind that comes from understanding how easily something can be missed, how a single overlooked angle, a single hidden recess, can hold answers that entire search efforts never reached. And for a moment he says nothing, allowing the deputy to finish, allowing the full shape of what has been found to settle into the air around them. Caleb closes his eyes briefly, drawing in a slow breath that tastes faintly of dust and sun and something older beneath it, something that feels like closure even before it is fully named, and when he opens them again, he looks down at Rex, who has now eased back into a seated position. Gaze still directed toward the canyon, but no longer fixed with the same intensity, as if the need to insist has passed, as if the truth no longer requires guarding because it has been seen. The wind shifts once more, softer now, brushing across the ridge and down into the canyon below, and in that movement there is a subtle change, not in sound, not in temperature, but in presence, as if something that had lingered unresolved has finally been acknowledged, and Caleb understands then, in a way that does not need explanation, that this was never about discovering something new. It was about finding something that had always been there, waiting for someone, or something, to refuse to walk away. The deputy's final words settle over the ridge like dust after a long fall, quiet but impossible to ignore, and no one rushes to speak, not because they do not understand, but because they do, and understanding something like this does not come with noise, it comes with stillness, with a kind of weight that presses gently against the chest and asks to be carried rather than explained. Sheriff Grady removes his sunglasses slowly, holding them in his hand as he looks out across the canyon, not at the exact spot anymore, but beyond it, as if tracing the years that have passed since this place was last searched, since names were spoken every day and then less often, and then only in quiet conversations that ended with the same unanswered question, and he exhales, long and steady, before lifting the radio again, his voice different now, softer but firmer, calling in what is needed next with a tone that leaves no room for doubt or dismissal. Caleb does not move closer, does not step forward to look again, because he does not need to see more than he already has, and instead he turns slightly, his gaze dropping to Rex, who now sits beside him rather than at the edge, close enough that their shoulders nearly touch, and the dog's posture has changed in a way only someone paying close attention would notice, the tension gone, the rigid focus softened into something calmer, something that feels like completion rather than anticipation. Caleb rests his hand against Rex's neck, fingers brushing through the coarse fur. And for a moment he simply stands there, letting the quiet settle between them, letting the truth below exist without needing to be reshaped into words, and in that moment he remembers something he had not thought about in years, a briefing room, a map spread across a table, someone pointing at a location and saying it had already been cleared, already been checked, and the quiet doubt he felt even then, the sense that sometimes the first answer is not the final one. That sometimes what is missed is not gone, it is simply waiting for someone willing to look again. The sound of movement below resumes, careful, methodical, and above, the deputies begin to shift into a different rhythm, one that is slower, more deliberate, each action measured not just for efficiency but for respect, and the canyon, which had felt empty before, now feels full in a different way, not crowded, not loud, but present. As if the space itself is acknowledging what has been found and allowing it to be seen at last. Rex lifts his head slightly, ears turning, as if listening to something beyond human range, and then he looks up at Caleb, just for a second, their eyes meeting in a quiet exchange that needs no translation, and Caleb gives a small nod, not as a command, not as a signal, but as a simple recognition of what the dog has done, what he refused to let go, and Rex blinks once, slow and steady, before lowering his gaze again, no longer searching, no longer insisting. Just being. Sheriff Grady walks back toward them after a few minutes, his steps slower than before, the urgency replaced with something steadier, and he stops a few feet away, looking at Caleb, then at Rex, and there is a shift in his expression that had not been there when he first arrived, something closer to respect, to acknowledgement, and he speaks quietly, choosing his words with care, explaining only what needs to be said, not in detail, not in ways that would break the moment, but enough to confirm what they all already understand, that the search that ended years ago has, in a way, just begun again, and this time it has found what it was missing. Caleb listens without interrupting, his posture unchanged, his attention steady, and when Grady finishes there is no dramatic response, no visible release, just a slow breath and a single glance back toward the canyon, as if marking the place in his mind, not for what was hidden there, but for what has now been brought back into the light. The sun has shifted lower now, casting longer shadows across the ridge, the air cooling by a few degrees, and the wind carries a softer edge, less restless, more settled, and as the team continues their work below, Caleb turns slightly, guiding Rex a few steps back from the edge, not pulling, not urging, just moving together in a quiet understanding that the place has given what it held, and that sometimes, the only thing left to do is to stand witness to the moment when silence finally breaks. The sun dips lower, turning the canyon walls into layers of copper and shadow, and the air cools just enough to carry a different kind of stillness, one that does not press but settles, like a long-held breath finally released, and Caleb stands a few yards back from the edge now, one hand resting loosely at his side, the other brushing absently along Rex's back as if confirming that he is still there, still real. Still the same dog who refused to move when everything else said it was time to walk away. Below, the movement continues, careful and deliberate, voices kept low, every action guided not by urgency but by respect, and though Caleb cannot see the details anymore from where he stands, he does not need to, because the shape of the truth has already formed, already taken its place in the quiet spaces between what was known and what was never fully understood. Sheriff Grady remains near the edge, speaking occasionally into his radio, coordinating what comes next, but even his tone has softened, the edge of skepticism gone, replaced by something steadier, something that carries the weight of responsibility rather than doubt, and when he glances back toward Caleb and Rex, there is no question left in his expression, only acknowledgement, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud. Rex shifts his weight slightly, then lowers himself onto the ground, front paws stretched forward, head resting just above them, eyes still open but no longer fixed, no longer searching, and Caleb notices the change immediately, the subtle difference between a dog on alert and a dog at peace, and he exhales quietly, feeling something in his own chest loosen in response, as if the tension he had not fully recognized has finally found its way out. The wind moves again, softer now, brushing through the sparse brush along the ridge, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and stone and something older beneath it. Something that feels less like absence and more like presence, and Caleb finds himself looking out across the horizon rather than down into the canyon, his gaze following the long stretch of land that fades into distance, thinking not about what was hidden, but about how easily something can remain unseen even when it is close, even when it is waiting. He remembers the way people spoke about the case years ago, the way conversations would slow when the names were mentioned, how hope would shift into silence, how time would move forward while something remained unresolved beneath it, and he realizes now that closure does not always come from answers found quickly, sometimes it arrives slowly, carried by something that refuses to forget, something that does not measure time the way people do. Rex lifts his head slightly, turning it toward Caleb, their eyes meeting for a brief moment, and there is no urgency in that look, no insistence. Just a quiet steadiness that feels like trust fulfilled rather than trust demanded, and Caleb nods. Once, almost instinctively, as if acknowledging a task completed, a promise kept without ever being spoken, the sounds from below begin to fade into a more distant rhythm as the team settles into their work, the initial tension replaced by a calm, methodical pace, and above, the ridge grows quieter, the space between each movement stretching longer, softer, until it feels as though the canyon itself has shifted from holding to releasing. Sheriff Grady walks over again after some time, stopping beside Caleb without breaking the quiet, and for a moment neither of them speaks, both simply standing there, looking out at the same horizon, sharing an understanding that does not require explanation. And when Grady finally does speak, his voice is low, almost reflective, as he mentions that sometimes cases do not end when people think they do, sometimes they wait, sometimes they come back in ways no one expects, and Caleb listens, then gives a small nod, not in agreement or disagreement, but in recognition, because he has seen that truth before in different forms, in different places, and it has never been loud, never been obvious, always something quiet that lingers until someone pays attention. Rex rises slowly to his feet, stretching once, then standing close at Caleb's side, no longer drawn toward the edge, no longer anchored to that single point, and Caleb rests his hand briefly on the dog's head before turning slightly away from the canyon, not to leave completely, not yet, but to step back into a space where the weight of what has been found can settle into something that can be carried forward. And as the last light of the sun brushes across the ridge, fading into the deepening blue of evening, the place that once held silence now holds something else, something quieter but stronger, the kind of truth that does not need to be spoken to be understood. The night does not arrive all at once, it settles in slowly, folding itself over the canyon in layers of deepening blue and soft shadow, until the last trace of sunlight slips behind the distant ridge and leaves the sky stretched wide and quiet above them, and Caleb remains where he is for a while longer, not out of obligation, not because anyone asked him to stay, but because leaving too quickly would feel like turning away from something that deserves to be witnessed fully, even in silence. And beside him Rex stands calm and steady, no longer anchored to the edge, no longer pulled by that invisible thread that held him there for so long, his posture loose now, his breathing even, as if whatever he had been carrying has finally been set down. Below, the final movements continue with care and patience, voices kept low. Lights beginning to glow softly against the darkening stone as the team works through the last steps of a process that is no longer about searching, but about bringing something home. And though Caleb cannot see the details from where he stands, he understands the meaning of it, understands that this is the part where answers become real, where absence becomes something that can finally be named, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the canyon walls, a faint sound of wind moves through the open land, carrying with it a quiet that feels different now, not empty, not hollow, but complete. Sheriff Grady steps back from the edge once more, his silhouette outlined against the dim sky, and he pauses for a moment before walking over to Caleb, stopping beside him without breaking the stillness, and when he speaks, it is not in the tone of a man giving orders or reporting findings, but in the voice of someone who has just seen something settle into place, something that has been out of reach for far too long, and he says simply that the families will be notified tonight. That there will be answers where there have only been questions, and Caleb nods, not because the words require a response, but because they carry weight, the kind that is felt more than heard. Rex shifts slightly closer, brushing against Caleb's leg, and Caleb rests his hand on the dog's head, fingers pressing gently into the fur, and for a moment he closes his eyes, not in exhaustion, not in relief exactly, but in acknowledgement, because he knows that this did not begin today, did not start with a walk or a chance decision. This began long before, carried quietly through time by a creature that does not measure years the way people do, that does not forget simply because others have learned how to move on. The stars begin to appear overhead, faint at first, then clearer as the sky deepens, and the canyon below fades into darkness, its edges softened, its depth hidden once more, but not in the same way as before, not in a way that conceals, but in a way that rests, and Caleb looks out across the horizon one last time, taking in the shape of the land, the silence, the stillness that now feels earned rather than empty, and he understands something then, something simple but steady, that not every ending arrives with noise. Not every truth demands to be announced, sometimes it is enough that it has been found, that it has been seen, that it no longer has to wait. Rex lifts his head slightly, looking out into the distance for a moment before turning back toward Caleb, and there is no urgency in that movement, no pull toward the canyon anymore, just presence, just companionship, and Caleb gives a small nod, the kind that marks a quiet agreement, and together they take a few slow steps away from the edge, not turning their backs on what was found, but carrying it with them in a way that does not weigh heavy, in a way that feels like something set right. Behind them, the faint glow of lights continues its careful work, and ahead of them, the path stretches out under the night sky, familiar and unchanged, and as they walk, the sound of their footsteps soft against the dirt, Caleb understands that some stories do not end in victory, they end in something quieter, something steadier, something that feels like grace. The kind that arrives not when everything is fixed, but when what was lost is finally no longer forgotten.